Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 6, 2015, the gentleman from New York, Mr. Jeffries, is recognized for 60 minutes as a designee of the Minority Leader.
I thank the Chair. Mr. Chair, I ask unanimous consent that all members be given 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks and add any extraneous material relevant to the subject matter of this discussion.
Without objection.
Thank you. It's an honor and a privilege for me to rise today and to co-anchor, along with my distinguished colleague from the great state of Ohio, Representative Joyce Beatty, this CBC Special Order Hour, this hour of power. Once again, we're privileged to take to the floor of the People's House to discuss an issue that should be relevant to every member of this institution on behalf of the 320 million plus Americans that we represent in this great country. And that is the gun violence epidemic. America has 5% of the world's guns, 5% of the world's population, but 50% of the world's guns. It's estimated that there are more than 300 million guns in circulation throughout this country. And so it seems to me reasonable that we would do everything possible to ensure that not a single one of those guns finds themselves in the hands of individuals who would do us harm. And that, in many ways, is what President Obama has done as it relates to his most recent executive actions. And so today, members of the Congressional Black Caucus will come to the House floor to discuss those executive actions, discuss the issue of gun violence, discuss the steps that we should be taking here in this chamber in order to keep the people of America that we all collectively represent safe. It's now my honor and my privilege to yield to my classmate and my co-anchor for this CBC Special Order Hour. I look forward to anchoring with her throughout the entire year. She's been a tremendous champion for working families, for the middle class, for small business owners, and of course for the young people who are ravaged in our communities all across this country by gun violence. I now will yield to my colleague, Representative Joyce Beatty.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, I rise this evening proud to stand with my Congressional Black Caucus Special Order Hour co-anchor, Congressman Jeffries from the 8th Congressional District of New York. Mr. Jeffries, it is my honor to stand here today as we undertake an urgent dialogue on how we, as elected representatives of the people, can work together to end gun violence. I look forward to engaging with Congressman Jeffries and our Congressional Black Caucus colleagues in scholarly debate on the issues plaguing African Americans, African American communities, and to develop solutions to the problems our constituents face. As the conscience of the Congress, the Congressional Black Caucus will remain on the forefront of issues that affect Black Americans in particular and the nation in general. For tonight, our anchor, Congressman Jeffries, has pointed out the CBC will continue to shed light on the epidemic of gun violence, standing our ground, ending gun violence in America. Mr. Speaker, last week we opened the second session of the 114th Congress. 435 of us traveled back to Washington, ready to serve our constituents and work for the betterment of our nation. Unfortunately, Mr. Speaker, whatever spirit of bipartisanship may have been present at the end of 2015 as Republicans and Democrats worked together on key pieces of legislation has disappeared at the precise time our nation is calling on Congress to pass common sense legislation to keep guns out of the wrong hands. We find ourselves confronted with startling statistics that no nation should endure. Let me just take a moment to share just a few. We know that the impact of gun violence affects every community and every congressional district. However, African American children and teens are 17 times more likely to die from gun homicide than white youth, according to the Center for Disease Control and Prevention. While African Americans make up 15% of youth in America, African Americans account for 45% of children and teen gun deaths in 2010. According to Everytown for Gun Safety, 88 Americans die every day from gun violence, Mr. Speaker. Roughly 50% of those killed are African American men, who comprise just 6% of the population. Homicide is the primary cause of death among African Americans aged 15 to 24. Mr. Speaker, these numbers should be unthinkable, unimaginable, but they are the unfortunate reality in which African American communities live. In the words of Dr. Martin Luther King, whose legacy we honor next month, he said, "We find ourselves confronted with the fierce urgency of now." And Mr. Speaker, it is now that our nation is in an urgent crisis. Yes, we are trapped in congressional inaction. Shameful. So our president decided he would not stand by idly while Congress did nothing to prevent another Newtown, another Charleston, another Tucson. With tears in his eyes, he reflected on the senseless killings caused by gun violence over the course of his administration. President Obama announced new executive actions to confront the epidemic of gun violence in America. While mocked by some Republicans for showing emotion at the loss of so many lives, I am here to say I proudly stand with my president on the actions he's taken to prevent gun violence in America. These executive actions will save lives and make the country safer without infringing on law-abiding individuals' rights to firearms. You will hear from our colleagues tonight talking about the president's actions. I look forward to continuing to work with my colleagues and to address gun violence. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you, Representative Beatty, for laying out the case in such an eloquent and compelling fashion and pointing out that with respect to gun safety and gun violence prevention in America, it's long past the time when we act with the fierce urgency of now. Tens of thousands of Americans have died as a result of gun violence since the moment you and I first set foot in this institution. And not a single thing has been done by the House of Representatives to prevent those deaths. That is shameful, as you've pointed out, and we need a change of course. Let me now yield to the distinguished gentleman, the ranking member, lead Democrat on the House Education and Workforce Committee, once, of course, chaired by the legendary Adam Clayton Powell, and Representative Scott has continued in that tremendous visionary tradition, and I now yield to the gentleman from Virginia.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank the gentleman from New York and the gentlelady from Ohio for organizing tonight's special order to focus on the toll that gun violence has taken on communities across America, and especially the disproportionate impact it has had within communities of color. Tonight's conversation comes at an important time. On average, every day, more than 30 people are killed by firearms, many in mass murders. Now, rather than do what they say is celebrate the problem, I want to talk about solutions. Last Tuesday, the President announced the executive actions that his administration will take to prevent gun violence. I commend the President for taking this action in light of the current congressional leadership's refusal to responsibly address this epidemic. These executive actions will ensure stronger enforcement of current laws and will reduce the number of lives lost to gun violence. To begin with, the President's executive actions will narrow the gun show and internet loophole by actually enforcing licensing requirements for gun dealers and overhauling the background check system to make it more effective and efficient. Under current law, only licensed gun dealers are required to perform criminal background checks for all gun sales, and only those individuals deemed to be engaged in the business of dealing in guns are required to obtain a license from the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, the ATF. The executive actions make it clear that the common sense proposition that anyone making a profit from the sale of guns or who regularly makes gun sales or earns a livelihood from gun sales is in fact engaged in the business and therefore must obtain the license and conduct required criminal background checks, even if those sales occur at gun shows or over the internet. The question of whether someone is engaged in business will be determined by normal legal standards as opposed to people just declaring themselves to be exempt, which is going on now. Some of these people are even making a living selling firearms. They need to get a license. This is the present law, and the President has said that he will enforce it. The Federal Bureau of Investigations, as part of executive actions, will overhaul its National Instant Criminal Background Check System, the NICS system, to make it more effective and efficient by hiring more than 230 additional examiners and other staff so the Bureau can process background checks 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and improve its notification of local authorities when prohibited persons unlawfully attempt to purchase a gun. These people are currently breaking the law when they illegally try to buy a firearm. Local law enforcement officials need to be informed. According to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, this system has already caught more than 2 million people trying to buy guns illegally, and they need to be held accountable for breaking the law. Furthermore, dealers will also be required to notify law enforcement if their guns are lost or stolen in transit. This transparency and accountability will ensure that law enforcement will be notified and can begin investigations when these losses occur. The executive actions will also leverage the buying power of the Departments of Defense, Department of Justice, Department of Homeland Security to conduct or sponsor research into gun technology. When the federal government begins buying guns using that kind of technology, it will make it more likely that this technology will be used. There is technology that makes it impossible for anyone other than the true owner to use weapons, and the more purchases the federal government makes, the more likely it is that that technology will actually be installed in future weapons. The President has also directed the departments to review the availability of smart gun technology on a regular basis and to explore potential ways to further its use and to encourage research to more broadly improve gun safety. The President's plan also proposes a new $500 million investment to increase access to mental health treatment to ensure that people who need help do not fall through the cracks of the mental health system. This is in addition to the huge increases in mental health funding under the Affordable Care Act. Mental health services are considered essential services, and so now virtually all health insurance policies include mental health coverage. While modest and within the President's executive authority, these executive actions will go a long way in keeping guns out of the hands of people who never should be able to purchase them in the first place. But that's executive action. Congress needs to act so that more can be done to actually protect citizens from gun violence. The House Democratic Gun Violence Prevention Task Force has consistently reiterated that Washington has a moral obligation to do something to address our nation's gun violence epidemic. The most effective way to address this epidemic is through comprehensive, evidence-based policy proposals. Our task force has put forth several proposals that will go a long way in achieving these goals. These proposals include reinstating and strengthening the assault weapon ban, reducing the size of magazines, implementing universal background checks, cracking down on illegal gun trafficking and straw purchases, improving our mental health system, and implementing comprehensive, locally tailored, evidence-based violence prevention and intervention programs. The gentleman from California, Representative Mike Thompson, is the chair of the House Democratic Gun Violence Prevention Task Force, and he has introduced a resolution to establish a select committee of the House to study gun violence. That resolution is co-sponsored by Democratic leader Nancy Pelosi and the 11 co-chairs of the task force. The proposed select committee would be comprised of 6 Republicans and 6 Democrats who would study the research and issue a final report and recommendations, including legislative proposals, within 60 days of its establishment. It would study and make recommendations to address many issues, including the causes of mass shootings, methods to improve federal firearm purchasing background check systems, connections between access to firearms and dangerously mentally ill individuals, federal penalties for trafficking and straw purchasing of firearms, loopholes that allow some domestic abusers continued access to firearms, linkages between firearms and suicide, gun violence effect on public health, the correlation between state gun violence prevention laws and the incidence of gun violence, the importance of having reliable, accurate information on gun violence and its toll on our nation, the implementation of effective gun violence prevention laws in accordance with the Second Amendment of our Constitution, the rates of gun violence in large metropolitan areas. Mr. Speaker, by taking deliberate, research-based approach to gun violence, treating it as we would a public health challenge, we can significantly reduce the ravages of gun violence. The President is limited by his executive authority on what alone he can do to address this epidemic. Long-term reforms can only be achieved through congressional action. I hope that the leadership of the Congress will follow the President's lead and act in a bipartisan basis to address this critical issue using public health strategies and evidence-based proposals. Again, Mr. Speaker, I thank the gentleman from New York and the gentlelady for Ohio for coordinating this special issue. This is a special order, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Representative Scott, for laying out the steps that are being taken by the President in such a compelling way and explaining why they are items that we should all support, as well as some of the steps that need to be taken legislatively by this Congress in order to deal with the fact that more than 10,000 Americans a year die as a result of gun violence-related homicides. Let me now yield to the distinguished gentlelady from California, an incredibly eloquent and passionate voice for the voiceless, and we appreciate her service here in the Congress, not just on behalf of the district that she represents in Northern California, but certainly on behalf of the people of the United States of America. I yield now to Congresswoman Barbara Lee.
Thank you very much. First, let me thank the gentleman from New York for those very kind remarks, but also I want to thank yourself and Congresswoman Beatty for organizing this very important special order and for your tremendous leadership, Congressman Jeffries and Beatty, on ensuring public safety. You know, your leadership, both Congresswoman Beatty and Jeffries, it has been bold, it's been visionary, not just as a result of the very recent tragedies, but for many, many years, even before both of you came to Congress. So it's an honor serving with both of you in this body. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak this evening. Also, I want to just thank Congresswoman Robin Kelly, who is Vice Chair of our Gun Violence Task Force, but also chairs the CBC's Health Brain Trust. I want to thank you for your tireless work to ensure that gun violence is treated as a public health problem, which it is. Madam Speaker, I rise this evening with my colleagues in the Congressional Black Caucus to call on Congress to do something about the epidemic of gun violence that's harming our communities. Since the start of the year, just 11 days ago, 9 of my constituents have already become victims of gun violence, including an elementary school teacher and an innocent mother pushing her child in a stroller. Just this weekend alone, my community suffered 3 gun homicides. My thoughts are with the victim's family at this very terrible, difficult time. But we have to do something. Enough is enough. Congress can and must do more to stop this senseless violence, whether it's Charleston, Oak Creek, Sandy Hook, or the streets of Oakland, or wherever. Too many people have already lost their lives. Too many families have buried loved ones, and too many lives have been changed forever because of catastrophic injuries as a result of gun violence. Madam Speaker, now is the time for action. Our constituents are demanding action. The country is demanding action. I've received hundreds of calls and emails from my constituents, and I know other members are also hearing from their constituents. They're calling for action as well. Earlier today in my own district, Oakland City Council President Lynette Gibson McElhaney, she buried her grandson, 17-year-old Torian Hughes, who was shot and killed during a robbery just days before Christmas. This has been a very difficult period for Councilmember McElhaney and her family. So in addition to our prayers, not only for my council member's family, but for all of those in our country who have been victims of gun violence, we must do something. We must do something in all of their memories. Let me be clear. Now, Congress can no longer ignore the massive toll that this epidemic is having in our constituents, their families, and communities. Last week, we joined with our colleagues and millions of Americans in applauding President Obama's actions to reduce gun violence in our nation. Thanks to the President's leadership, there will be more background checks, better enforcement of existing gun laws, improved mental health services, and new research on how to end this epidemic of gun violence. But more action is needed to stop the more than 30,000 gun deaths that occur in our nation each and every year. Congress must pass common sense gun reform, like closing the gun show loophole, bipartisan measures that are supported by the vast majority of Americans and gun owners. Congress must also fund the expansion of mental health services, but this should not be an excuse, of course, to do nothing on gun safety. But we've got to provide the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives the resources it needs to enforce our nation's gun laws. Now, as a member of the Appropriations Committee, I have fought along with my colleagues to get these vital public safety resources in the appropriations bills which keep our communities safe. We must also end the extreme data restrictions that restrict law enforcement's ability to protect public safety and prevent policymakers from addressing gun violence as a public health issue. That's why I introduced last year it's H.R. 1449 as the T-Hart Restrictions Repeal Act, which would repeal the data restrictions on gun sales and background checks. These data restrictions are commonly called the T-Hart restrictions. They prevent data on gun background checks from being released to the public. These provisions currently impede public safety by requiring the National Criminal Background Check System records to be destroyed, mind you, destroyed within 24 hours, prohibiting the ATF from requiring licensed dealers to conduct annual inventory checks to detect lost or stolen firearms, and restricting local and state law enforcement from using trace data to fully investigate corrupt dealers and traffickers. This is outrageous. We've got to restrict and repeal these T-Hart amendments right away. They will help tackle the bad apple gun dealers who provide dangerous weapons to criminals. It's estimated that just 5% of sellers supply the weapons used in nearly 90% of gun crimes. The T-Hart restrictions block access to vital data that lawmakers, law enforcement, and federal agencies need to tackle gun violence in our community. Of course, many of us are proud to support Congresswoman Kelly's bill, which would allow the Surgeon General to study gun violence as a public health issue, and the Consumer Product Safety Commission to regulate firearms. Madam Speaker, the time for action is now. Let's start listening to the American people and insist that Congress do something. It is really disingenuous to criticize the president for issuing common sense gun safety measures when we have been trying for years in this body, for years, to get these sensible bills passed. The Speaker should allow these and many other bills to come to the floor so that Congress can act. No more excuses. We should support Congressman Thompson's proposal to establish a select committee on gun violence. The Speaker should do this now. And so we can't continue to really allow the misinformation to get out about Congress. We need to do our job. We've been trying, many of us, the Congressional Black Caucus and others, especially Democrats, for many years to try to get the Speaker to bring these bills to the floor. And so what did the President do? He had to do something. But no more excuses. Congress needs to act. So I thank Congresswoman Beatty and Jeffries for this very important special hour and for your tremendous leadership. Thank you again.
Again, I thank the distinguished gentlelady from California for her wonderful remarks and observations, and of course, her support for the President's executive actions on gun safety, making it clear that the President was left with no choice but to act. Tens of thousands of Americans die each and every year, either as it relates to homicide or suicide through a firearm, and nothing was happening here in the United States Congress. The classic definition of legislative insanity is to do the same exact thing, which in this instance is nothing, and expect that things were going to change for the safety and the well-being of the American people. And that's why we're here on the floor today, expressing strong support for the President's executive actions and pushing this institution to do more and finish the job that the President of the United States of America started. It's now my honor and privilege to yield to the distinguished gentlelady from Houston, a forceful advocate, the lead Democrat on the relevant committee on the House Judiciary side of the equation as it relates to criminal justice reform and gun safety. And she, of course, has been a tremendous champion for the people that she serves down in H-Town as well as across the country. I yield now to Representative Sheila Jackson Lee.
Let me thank the gentleman from New York for yielding, and as has been stated by my colleagues, I want to add my applause as well for the thoughtfulness of the gentleman's leadership on a number of issues, but certainly his pronounced leadership on criminal justice reform and on the Judiciary Committee, and then to be joined by former leader of the Ohio State Legislature, and she has not forgotten her talents of leadership, and that is Congresswoman Joyce Beatty, who joins us. And if I might put words in both your mouths, with a sense of outrage about where we are today. And I say that because I would like to stand here with an enormous amount of outrage for where we are and why we are here. I want to add my appreciation to the Congressional Black Caucus and the chairman, Mr. Butterfield, and of course, Congresswoman Dr. Kelly, who has been a great leader on the issues dealing with health care. And I just want to cite to her a lady that came to this Congress more than a decade ago, Deborah Prothrow Stith. You may have read her writings, and she pronounced during that time that violence, gun violence, was a health crisis. And that was some many years ago. And unfortunately, with all of her expert writings, we still couldn't get movement. I'm going to take a slightly different perspective, and if I could just take these few moments to give you an anecdotal story, which many of you might find absolutely with a great deal of shock, if you will. And that is the limit to which gun rights advocates who mislead the American people on any ideas for gun safety or gun regulation as taking guns away. I was in a meeting where someone was trying to understand why President Obama, in his excellent presentation about securing America and protecting our children from gun violence, was being associated with the idea of taking over 345 million guns. This is what is represented to be President Obama's message. He will confiscate through his process of gun testing or making sure that there are background checks for everyone, that he wanted to confiscate 345 million guns, which has been determined to be located in 65 million places here in the United States. Can I, in a public forum on this august floor of the House, say that we as members of Congress, and I think Republicans will admit this, have no evidence, no documentation, that the White House intends to confiscate guns. No manner of level of increased ATF officers could ever do that. Why this mischaracterization is here. But listen to this. Gun rights advocates have made a lot of claims over the years that the Second Amendment they interpret means that they can buy virtually any gun they want and take it pretty much anywhere. Well, basically, that does exist, except for the basic constraints of background checks, which now the president has expanded to ensure that if you are in a gun show, this is a gun show loophole, and you're sitting next to the stall of a licensed gun person, and you're in the business of selling guns, why shouldn't you be either licensed or require basically background checks? But listen to this. In an ongoing legal battle in Florida, they lay claim to a newfangled Second Amendment right, the right not to have anyone talk to gun owners about their guns. Specifically, gun advocates don't want doctors discussing guns or the potential harms that guns may cause with their patients. And while mere talk about guns might seem to have nothing to do with the right to keep or bear arms, the advocates contend that the Constitution is on their side. Last month, for the third time in the same suit, a federal court of appeals agreed. This is very bizarre. The case is filed under the name of Wohlschlager versus the governor of the state of Florida. Although First and Second Amendment buffs may recognize it under the cutesy name Docs versus Glocks, it started when some gun owners and the National Rifle Association told Florida legislators that their doctors were harassing them by asking about gun safety. The legislators responded by passing a law that bars healthcare workers from discussing or recording anything about their patients' gun ownership or safety practices that could be deemed in bad faith, irrelevant, or harassing. 12 other states are thinking about it, and now we have the Firearms Privacy Act. This is in the face of the number of homicides that are in this country, and let me cite to my colleagues that America is the #1 country out of Western nations that has the highest number of cases of homicide by firearm per 100,000. The closest that comes to them is 0.7 by Italy. Then Taiwan, Canada, Spain, 0.2, Germany, 0.2. And all the news stories that we see on violent disruptions in various places and protests, there are numbers of gun violence on homicides is minuscule. Australia, 0.1. UK, 0.1. France, 0.1. South Korea, 0.03. And finally, Japan, 0.01. If that doesn't get our attention, I don't know what does. Then look at this map. This map, 353 mass shootings in America in 2015. My colleagues can see. Is this anything to be proud of? Mass shootings not by knives, not by throwing stones, but by guns. This is what America is to the world. A sea of red of mass shootings. So much so that you can't even see background in some of the parts of this nation. And yet, there are laws that are being passed to stop health professionals from asking whether you have guns that might in fact endanger your children or yourselves. Thank you. On average, more than 100,000 people in the United States are shot in murders, assaults, and other crimes. More than 32,000 people die from gun violence, including 2,677 children under the age of 18. Gun deaths, justified versus criminal. Studies also found that for every one justified homicide in the United States involving a gun, guns were used in 44 criminal homicides. In all of our communities, we see young black men being felled by gun violence. Young people in our communities being felled by gun violence, or innocent storekeepers being felled by gun violence, or in the instance of the Philadelphia police officer, that all of us respect the dangers of law enforcement, recognizing that we can work together by building prepared and trained law enforcement officers to avoid the violence with guns. But in this instance of this individual who point blank shot at an officer with a gun, who has now been determined possibly to have heard voices, though he said he was inspired by ISIS. Again, someone wanted to suggest that it wasn't anything that Obama could have done. It was a stolen police gun, and it's out on the streets. And obviously, we don't have enough people enforcing against the trafficking of stolen guns. Mass shootings, the U.S. has a far higher number of mass shootings than any others I've indicated. Mental health, approximately 1 in 4 American adults have a mental illness. And every time we hear of these mass shootings, defense comes, which they have a right to talk about this person's severe criminal mental illness condition. Guns and suicide is the leading cause of related deaths in America. More than 60% of deaths by guns in the country are the result of individuals using these weapons, intending to commit suicide. Not knives, not stones, not even poison or overdose on drugs. Guns and domestic violence provide a deadly outcome. Law enforcement killed by guns. Each year, hundreds of law enforcement officers lose their lives in gun violence, having been shot to death while protecting their communities. And of course, we know that we have experienced tragic incidences under the authority of law where people have been killed, and the community is over the top in frustration. Background checks check lives, and the tragedy of Mother Emanuel is the individual went to buy guns and the store owner said, you know, it's taking too long. And so I support President Obama's very astute and thoughtful approach. And out of that, I'm very glad to have introduced 2 initiatives. One, 4315, Mental Health Access and Gun Violence, which is to capture President Obama's, along with Karen Bass. And I encourage my colleagues to sign on to 4315, which authorizes $500 million for health treatment access and to assist in the reporting of relevant disqualifying mental health information to the FBI's background check system, NICS, not to violate the privacy, but to give more information to the database, because that certainly would be part of saving lives. And then, as I conclude, H.R. 4316, that I'm pleased to have joined me in this, Congresswoman Kelly, the Gun Violence Reduction Resources Act that authorizes the hiring of 200 million additional ATF agents. The very points of which my Republican friends are saying, but yet they're condemning what the President has offered. I would say to my colleagues in closing, if we don't do this for any other reason, to take and codify the President's initiatives on NCIS, on data collection, on research regarding safer guns, on background checks, and closing the gun show loophole. If we don't do it, we should do it for the children. From December 2012 to December 2013, at least 100 children were killed in unintentional shootings, almost 2 every week, 61% higher than federal data reflect. About 2/3 of these unintended deaths, 65%, took place in the home or vehicle that belonged to the victim's family, most often with the guns that were legally owned but not secured. I remind you of that Supreme Court challenge or that law in Florida where doctors can't secure information to protect the patients or the children of these families. More than 2/3 of these tragedies could be avoided if gun owners stored their guns responsibly and prevented children from accessing them. I've introduced legislation on gun storage. I call it safety and responsibility, but yet unfortunately is perceived as attacking the Second Amendment. My good friend from New York, let me thank you for yielding this time and allow me to just leave us with the point that as the Congressional Black Caucus stands on the floor, we need partners in doing the right thing. And I hope before the President leaves office, he'll have the opportunity to reasonably and rationally sign bills that will save lives. I yield back.
Thank the distinguished gentlelady for yielding back and for the tremendous work that you continue to do on the Judiciary Committee. I look forward to partnering with you. And as you point out, the Second Amendment protects the right to bear arms. It should not protect the ability of others to utilize weapons, often of mass destruction, in doing harm to Americans without license or any legal basis for doing so. All we want is rational gun safety, gun violence prevention. And I look forward to continuing to work with you in that regard. It's now my honor and privilege to yield to one of my classmates. She's been a tremendous and forceful advocate for gun violence prevention measures, not only as the chair of the CBC Health Brain Trust, to which she has been tireless on so many different issues, but also in her capacity within the House Democratic Caucus, as well as a chair of the CBC Gun Violence Prevention Task Force, someone who stood up countlessly for the children in Chicago and the many others who've been dealing with unacceptable levels of gun violence. I yield now to Congresswoman Robin Kelly.
Thank you. I thank my good friends, the gentleman from New York, Mr. Jeffries, and the gentlelady from Ohio, the distinguished Representative Joyce Beatty, for this important special order hour tonight. Congressman Jeffries, you've chaired these special order hours for the Congressional Black Caucus in my first term, so it's good to see you back in the driver's seat with our classmate, Representative Beatty. Last year, I had the privilege of leading the special order hour with our colleague, the Honorable Donald Payne of New Jersey, and in the course of that year, we came to this floor to reflect on gun violence on one too many occasions, because it is an epidemic in communities across the country. In fact, we are 11 days into 2016, and there have already been 80 shootings in my hometown of Chicago. 4 people were shot and killed in less than 24 hours. I applaud President Obama's bold executive action that has been talked about tonight. I believe these policies will keep guns out of the hands of criminals and dangerous individuals. Now, if you listen to some, they will say they are trying to take our guns. There is nothing in the executive action that says that. The opposition is pushing fear, not fact. With over 30 Americans killed by guns every single day, inaction is not an option. In my nearly 3 years in Congress, the majority party has refused to do anything on gun violence. Not one hearing, not a single vote. To right what Congress has unfortunately made wrong, President Obama did what was necessary to address a threat to our long-term national security and economic stability. While we can't stop every criminal from committing every crime, we can take actions that will save lives. While President Obama's executive actions are crucial steps in reducing the senseless gun violence plaguing our nation, they don't absolve Congress of its moral responsibility to act. There are gaps in existing gun laws that leave us all vulnerable to gun violence. These holes are ones that only Congress can plug. I have 2 common sense bills which will complement President Obama's executive actions and help bring a reduction in firearm mortalities. The first bill, H.R. 224, the Recognizing Gun Violence as a Public Health Emergency Act, would require the Surgeon General to submit an annual report to Congress on the public health impact of gun violence. The bill currently has 135 co-sponsors, and I hope that this common sense proposal can get an up or down vote this year. Also, I recently introduced H.R. 225, the Firearm Safety Act, which would close the loopholes which prevents the Consumer Product Safety Commission from creating rules regarding the safety of firearms. Quite simply, if the Consumer Product Safety Commission can regulate teddy bears, bicycle helmets, and car seats, it should be able to regulate firearms. Simply improving safety lock quality and improving the storage safety will reduce accidents, misfires, and prevent theft, saving thousands of lives. Senseless gun violence has been plaguing our nation for far too long. It's simply unacceptable in the United States of America that gun violence is a leading cause of death for people under 24. It's time for us to come together to end the gun violence that's taking a generation of young Americans. I often ask just how many and just who has to die before we take action. I urge my colleagues to attend a funeral to see and feel the hurt and loss. Your standing for moments of silence and then sitting in silence does nothing to deal with this issue. Let's stop the hypocrisy and take action and save lives. I yield back.
Thank the distinguished gentlelady, my good friend from Illinois, for the very powerful presentation and for your steadfast leadership. One of the reasons why we believe that members of Congress need to act is because state laws are so inconsistent from one jurisdiction to the other. In New York, we experience gun violence in certain communities at unprecedented levels, notwithstanding the fact that we've got tremendously significant and robust gun violence prevention measures in place in New York. But the overwhelming majority of guns used to commit crimes in the Brooklyn communities represented by myself and Yvette Clarke actually come from the neighboring states of Pennsylvania, as well as up the I-95 corridor from states in the Deep South. Chicago, as Robin Kelly indicated, has been experiencing unprecedented levels of gun violence. Illinois actually has pretty robust gun safety, gun violence prevention laws on the books. But the overwhelming majority of guns used to commit crimes in Chicago come from the neighboring states of Indiana and Wisconsin that have lax laws. Out in South Central Los Angeles, the situation has gotten better over the last decade or so. California has pretty strong gun safety, gun violence prevention laws. The overwhelming majority of guns used to commit crimes in South Central Los Angeles, in East LA, actually come from the neighboring state of Arizona. That's why we need Congress to act to deal with what is a national problem. It's now my great honor and privilege to yield to my good friend and colleague, my sister from the neighboring congressional district to mine, who has been such a forceful advocate on behalf of the communities that she represents in Brooklyn. Let me now yield to the distinguished gentle lady from the 9th Congressional District of New York, Congresswoman Yvette Clarke.
Let me first start by thanking my brother from the neighboring district in Brooklyn, New York, Mr. Jeffries, alongside my sister from Ohio, Ms. Joyce Beatty, for their leadership in our Congressional Black Caucus Special Order Hour, discussing gun violence and gun safety measures. Let me also commend the Honorable Ms. Kelly, Robin Kelly of Illinois, for her leadership in doing the work that she's doing, not only with our Health Brain Trust, but being an outspoken and forceful advocate for the end to gun violence, not only for her district in Chicago, Illinois, but for all communities across this nation. Gun violence in the United States has reached epic proportions in the 21st century. The death, the trauma, the devastation that we are witnessing can no longer be tolerated. Madam Speaker, the Congress must act now. Over the past decade in America, more than 100,000 people have been killed as a result of gun violence, and millions more have been maimed by reckless and unlawful discharging of firearms. I applaud President Barack Obama for taking his historic executive action to address gun violence in our nation. These actions will save lives and make America a safer place. The President's actions will strengthen life-saving background checks, improve mental health services, and expand smart gun technology. We have all that we need in the United States to observe the Second Amendment rights of Americans, but at the same time, take our nation into the 21st century with responsible gun ownership that leaves little room for the illegal gun activities that we see taking place in terms of gun trafficking, in terms of the use of deadly arms in the hands of those who are unlicensed to hold them. As it relates to background checks, the proposals focus on new background check requirements that will enhance the effectiveness of the National Instant Criminal Background Check System, the NICS system, and greater education and enforcement efforts of existing laws at the state level. Specifically, it will direct the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives to require any business that engages in the sale of guns to obtain a federal license to do so and conduct background checks. It calls for increased funding to the ATF for the hiring of 200 new ATF agents and investigators to help enforce background checks, and requires the ATF to issue a rule requiring background checks for purchasers of certain dangerous firearms and other items who purchase them through a trust, corporation, or other legal entity, and encourages a greater communication between federal, state authorities on criminal history information. What could be wrong with that? That is within the boundary of our laws, within our constitutional rights, and it makes our nation safer. You know, I come to this floor today as one who considers herself to be a victim of gun violence. And we need to confront this right away because for many in our communities, it's not only those who have been physically harmed by gun violence, but those who have been traumatized by being a witness to gun violence. I had the unfortunate privilege, if you will, of being in the city council chambers of the New York City City Council when my colleague, the Honorable James E. Davis, was gunned down before all of his colleagues. Workplace domestic terrorism. And that incident has been with me from that day forward. To this day, I can, in a moment's notice, recall the trauma of that day, what it meant to see my colleague's life taken from him, to hear the gunplay that took place in the New York City Council chambers. And I'm not alone. There are millions of Americans who were witness to gun violence, who may have been maimed in gun violence, did not necessarily die as a result of it, but whose lives have been changed dramatically. We should not have another generation of Americans who can speak to the unspeakable horror of what it is to either be impacted directly in the loss of a loved one, or the families who have to recount the times when they had to be at the hospital to be with someone who's trying to recover from being gunned down. It is our obligation, it is our responsibility as lawmakers for this nation to get this right for future generations. So I applaud President Obama for doing what he could do within the parameters of his authority. It is now time for the United States House of Representatives to do our job. And with that, I yield back to you, Mr. Jeffries. Thank you.
Thank my good friend and colleague for that very powerful presentation and for pointing out the sensibility of supporting all of the President's efforts, but particularly as it relates to the ATF, which is the federal agency charged with enforcing our nation's gun laws. 200 additional agents is the bare minimum that we can do to make sure that the ATF has the manpower resources necessary to prevent the illegal trafficking of guns into places like Brownsville and East Flatbush, neighborhoods that Congresswoman Yvette Clarke so passionately represents. If you block funding for the ATF, what you essentially are doing is supporting the efforts of the merchants of death who rely on under enforcement by the ATF because of an absence of resources in order to flood communities like Chicago, South Central Los Angeles, parts of Brooklyn, and many other neighborhoods in Newark, New Jersey, with illegal weapons. And with that, let me yield to my good friend and colleague and also thank him, Congressman Donald Payne, as well as R. Kelly. D. Payne and R. Kelly was a fantastic combination. And we thank them for their distinguished service last year in leading the CBC Special Order Hour. I now yield to the gentleman from New Jersey.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Let me thank the gentleman from New York who passed the baton to R. Kelly and myself in 2015, and we've rounded the corner and put it back in his capable hands, along with our classmate, the Honorable Gentlelady from the great state of Ohio, Joyce Beatty, who is demonstrating day in and day out why she was such a great leader in the Ohio legislature and has brought those talents to bear on the entire nation. Madam Speaker, these are very serious times, and I want to start out by commending the President of the United States, President Obama, for, in the face of insurmountable odds, to not be hampered in wanting to do something with this terrible, terrible scourge that we suffer from in this nation. Gun violence impacts many different communities in this nation, some more than others, but it impacts us all. So I was proud to see the President step up and step forward and not be hampered in doing something. If the obstructionists on the other side of the aisle want to continue in that manner, then let them be. But he was going to do something. And so I want to commend my colleagues in the Congressional Black Caucus for uniting with the President on this great effort. We understand in our communities what this means. We are trying to articulate it to the American people, but we understand it. We live it, we feel it, we see it. The President's executive actions on gun control are steps in the right direction, but it is the responsibility of Congress to pass gun reform that makes our communities safer. I have joined, along with Robin Kelly, who mentioned 2 pieces of her legislation in terms of gun control, that after Sandy Hook several years ago, I proposed a piece of legislation that did not really see the light of day. But since the President has not given up on this effort, I will not either. I have a piece of legislation which is called the Safer Neighborhoods Gun Buyback Act. And we keep guns out of the hands of the wrong people by creating a voluntary federal gun buyback program. Under my bill, state and local governments, as well as gun dealers, would distribute smart prepaid debit cards to gun owners in exchange for their firearms. My bill incentivizes gun owners to voluntarily get guns off the streets. This will make our communities safer for our children, families, and our businesses. Common sense proposals like my bill are critical to ending our nation's epidemic of gun violence. This epidemic impacts every community in America, including in my district. Last year in the city of Newark, shootings increased 19% from 2014, and homicides rose by 8%. In 2015, there were at least 76 gun deaths in my district. 1/3 of all of the gun deaths in New Jersey last year happened in my district. Gun violence has had a disproportionate impact within the African American community and other urban areas. That is clear when you look at what's happening in my district throughout other African American communities in New Jersey, as opposed to other African American communities in New Jersey. We need a federal approach to gun violence because it is a problem across state lines. Case in point, New Jersey is a net importer of crime guns. In other words, more illegal weapons confiscated by law enforcement came from out of the state than that were purchased from in the state. Reducing gun violence is vital to the safety and security of American communities. My colleagues on the Republican side of the aisle should drop politics and pandering. They should instead join with Democrats in supporting the President and his common sense reforms, and like my gun buyback program, to address gun tragedies in all communities. And let me just say, Madam Speaker, no one wants to take guns away from anyone. We understand the laws and liberties that have made this nation great. But if we don't do something in reference to gun control, then it's shame on us. And with that, Madam Speaker, I yield back.
I thank the distinguished gentleman from New Jersey, and let me now yield the balance of our time to a dynamic new member of the House, Representative Stacey Plaskett.
Thank you so much for that introduction. And Madam Speaker, I rise today in support of our President's action toward making our communities safer by ensuring guns are less likely to end up in the hands of people who shouldn't have them. I want to thank my colleagues, Congressman Jeffers and Congresswoman Beatty, for bringing this hour here in Congress, and I'm thankful for the Congressional Black Caucus's Special Order Hour for taking time to educate the American people of the importance of our President's action. While this Congress, and in particular our Republican colleagues, have hemmed and dithered and engaged in political inertia, and at the end failed to act in this matter, suspected terrorists are free to legally purchase combat-style weapons. American cities and other areas of this country are besieged by gun crime, and thousands of lives are cut short. According to the American Academy of Pediatrics, guns cost twice as many deaths in young people as cancer, 5 times as many as heart disease, and 15 times as many as infections. Yet, we afford no funding for research and empirical data collection, while at the same time we spend hundreds of millions researching mitigating the effects of those other maladies. Every day this Congress fails to act, more American families mourn, more American lives are cut short, many in their prime, and more American cities continue to mount homicide and shooting statistics. Even in America's paradise, my home district of the United States Virgin Islands, this is so. In 2015, there were 40 homicides in the U.S. Virgin Islands. On a per capita basis, that homicide rate is more than double that of the city of Chicago. Gun violence in cities like Chicago, Los Angeles, and in other places, along with the United States Virgin Islands, sadly, are a near daily occurrence. And while we pause for moments of silence after mass shootings like the ones in Newtown or San Bernardino, the thousands of victims of mass shootings that play out daily in cities like New York City and the U.S. Virgin Islands go largely unnoticed and unrecognized. We want to bring these things to the people's voice right now, let people be aware of what's happening. And while the President's actions will undoubtedly save lives, we know that communities like our own, many minority communities across this country, there needs to be more comprehensive action to address the underlying issues that are at the root of gun violence. So I want to ask that this Congress act on these things. This Congress has in its power the ability to save thousands of lives. Let us not allow the nearly daily occurrence of mass shootings to become the new norm. We must act to pass comprehensive gun legislation in this Congress this year. Thank you so much, and I yield the balance of my time.
Okay.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield back.
Okay, thank you.